Chapter 4. There was a sense of awe pervading Malou as her three children's minds when they found themselves standing in the middle of the forest clearing near their old house. They looked around them and remained silent for a few moments before Malou said, "Well, here we are then. Are you okay?" Stefano and Gabby nodded, their eyes still travelling to the canopy of trees surrounding them. As for Daniel, he seemed indifferent to the beauty and tranquillity permeating the woods, yet searching for something. "And where is the cabin?" he asked. "Isn't there supposed to be a cabin somewhere around here?" He took a few steps in the direction of the edge of the meadow. "Are you looking for me, Daniel?" Damien asked, coming toward him. His attitude and attire was obviously disconcerting. His long beard, his cloak, and the walking cane he held in his right hand only served to baffle Daniel a little further than he already was. Are you Damienos?" Daniel stammered, backing away from the old man. "Yes, Daniel, he is," Malou replied, stepping beside her son. "He is our shepherd." She threw a pleading glance at Damienos. "Will you help us?" "Indeed, Mrs. Politano. I will help you, since it is my help that you sought. I had offered my assistance in time of need. Therefore, I am committed to respond to your call presently." "Thank you, Damienos," Malou said as Stefano and Gabby came to stand beside her. "These are my three children, Stefano, Daniel and Gabby. But you know that already, don't you?" "Oh yes, I know that already, as you say, my dear lady, and I should add that Daniel here is the most inquisitive soul among you, and perhaps the one for whom taming will be recommended." "Oh no you don't, you old wizard. You're not putting me in a cage like you did all these other people." Damien scuffled. "As I guessed it, rebellion is in your blood, son, such as it was in your father when he was young." "Yes, well, I guess he's done pretty well for himself, hasn't he?" "Not without a little guidance, he didn't, son," Damien chuckled again. "And I believe I should reassure you that I have no plans thus far to encage you. You need a little taming, no doubt, but nothing that could drive me to incarcerate you." "Are you going to be able to help us in locating our dad?" Stefano interposed, feeling that someone needed to refocus the conversation onto the subject at hand. "Yes, Stefano, I will assist the four of you in locating your father and your husband, Mrs. Politano. However, my assistance will be far from enough in this task. As you probably guessed, the burden of this task will rest mainly on your work and your acumen. The four of you will need to return to your house once again and find a book that will guide you to achieving your goal." "But Damienos, Dan and I already—" Malou began objecting. He shook his head and pointed to the cabin that was now visible at the edge of the clearing. "I believe we will be more comfortable talking about this in my lodgings." He began walking toward the little house. "Yes, you did accomplish 12 tasks after finding the book that concerned your previous dilemma, Mrs. Politano. However, this is quite a different problem, isn't it?" He turned his face to her. "Yes, it is, Damienos. And if we need to find another book in the old house, we will do so." As they approached the cabin, Gabby finally opened her mouth. "Didn't you say we needed to go to our old house to find the book, Mr. Damienos?" The shepherd threw her a gentle smile. "You have acquired the trait of impatience from your father, Gabby, and impatience will only lead to frustration, so I propose you abide by my suggestions and follow my lead with patience." He stopped on the front door stoop. "And by the way, just call me Damienos." He smiled again. Munching on the last piece of their pizza, Dan frowned. "You know, Gustavo, it's very strange. I can see things I've never considered before." "Like what?" Gustavo asked, wiping his mouth with his napkin. Another thing that somehow attested to the man's good upbringing. "This," Dan replied, pointing to the empty dish between them. "I mean our pizza. I see it in another place at another time." "You probably went to a place with your mum and dad not too long ago." "No, Gustavo, it's not like that." "Like what then? Like in a daydream, you mean?" "Yeah, I see my brother." Dan's face lit up suddenly. "Yeah, I've got a brother too, and I see him, Raphael, taking a pizza out of an oven, and—" He stopped talking and shook his head. "It's gone, sorry." Gustavo had let his friend talk. It was important not to interrupt him when he seemed to recall things, people or events. "Well, not bad for a first recall. You just discovered that you have a brother named Raphael. That's good, isn't it?" Dan appeared to be lost in thought. He looked up and across the table. "Yes, I suppose it is, but he's baking a pizza. That's totally bizarre." "Why should it be strange, Dan? He's probably a cook in a pizza restaurant somewhere." "No, Gustavo, he's much older, and I've never seen this place before." Dan shook his head again. "Anyway, I'll piece all this together someday, I suppose." "What about your friend Fabio? Any more memory of him?" "No, nothing. I remember us going to college together and his father, Professor Hugo, but apart from that, I can't recall anything else." "Well, your doctor did say that your long-term memory was okay, but the short-term one was going to be a bit harder to come back to you. Do you have a quarter?" Dan asked suddenly, looking at the couple of coins he had pulled out of his pocket. Sure, here, Gustavo replied, handing Dan what he asked. I'm going to call Mrs. Stevens and see if she can find out if I have any other residents than Boca Raton and get her to call my parents. Dan got up and was on his way to the payphone near the restaurant's counter when Gustavo stopped him. Hold on. Maybe it would be better for you to wait until you know if you live here before she calls your folks. Yeah, perhaps you're right. If I call my parents and tell them my story when there's no need, it wouldn't serve any purpose. Anyway, I'll call the old dear and see what she's got to say. Gustavo leaned against the back of his chair and watched Dan go to the phone. As the four of them followed Damianos inside the cabin, Stefano gasped. This is exactly like our living room in our house in Pennsylvania. He looked around him in disbelief. How did you do that? He asked Damianos. Why don't we sit down first? Malou told Stefano, leading him by the arm toward the couch. But Mum, this is extraordinary, Stefano argued mildly, plopping down beside his mother, while Gabby and Daniel sat in the two chairs. Didn't you hear what Mum said before we left? She said that whatever we saw or heard might look or sound strange. Daniel remarked, visibly happy to be the one recalling his brother to attention for once. Yeah, I heard what Mum said, but this is still beyond belief. Walking up between the two chairs, and now only clad of his flannel pants and shirt, Damianos said, This is one of the reasons for which I brought you here. I feel that you three children need a little explanation before you start on your journey. He pulled one of the wooden chairs that had been standing by the door and sat down. You see, Stefano, everything all of you will experience during the next days will be the product of your combined imagination. In this instance, your mother remembered the inside of my cabin the way she saw it the first time she and your father paid me a visit, or were led here, I should say. So it was imperative to respond to that recollection, and for you to see what she saw. He looked around him at the faces staring at him. I see that you don't quite believe your eyes or ears yet, do you? Oh, no, Gabby was quick to say. It's not that, Damianos. It's just hard for us to grasp the idea of us travelling in our imagination, as if everything was real. Oh, but my dear girl, everything you will see, feel, touch and experience from the moment you landed in the clearing is and will be very real. You're not sitting on the cloud of your dreams right now. You are physically living that dream. A bit like an insomniac would do, Stefano remarked. Exactly like it, yes, Damianos nodded. Perhaps with one exception, though. No one will wake you up or no one will be allowed to do you harm, and things will not hurt you either, as long as you keep your dream catcher close to your chest. But Mum said that you can't touch it either. Does that mean you're evil? Daniel, Malou shouted in surprise. Daniel had to be the one voicing his father's initial reaction to Damianos' presence in the hospital when he first appeared in their lives. No, I'm not evil, son, far from it, but my task requires me to stay outside and ward off malignant spirits that could try and hurt you. Moreover, I have to make sure that you perform whatever is required of you, whether the task is difficult or not. Are you going to tame us into submission, then? No, Daniel, I will not beat any one of you into submission. Yet I am a hard master when it comes to abiding by the precepts of God. When Dan hung up the phone and turned around to look at Gustavo, his face expressed his obvious annoyance. He must have learned something unpleasant, Gustavo thought, but smiled. Okay, what did the lady have to say for herself? Dan sat down. She must have been a schoolteacher or even a principal, he replied. She said that I'll have to go to her office and explain how I discovered my identity. He chuckled. How can I do that? He fixed his gaze on Gustavo. I can't very well go back to the recruiting office and ask to borrow my file now, can I? He grabbed his napkin and threw it on his empty plate. This is absurd. She wouldn't even give me an answer to my question about where I lived. Can you believe that? He sniggered. Maybe we could go back to the recruiting office and ask the good sergeant for copies of your application and a duplicate of your photo. Oh yeah, that was the other thing that she wanted, a photo identifying me as Dan Politano. How can I go back, Gustavo? What reason would I have for asking to copy my file? I don't know, Dan, but maybe simply asking would be the answer. You never know what the answer would be. See, by my way of thinking, you're an officer and anything you ask should be provided without explanation. That's ridiculous. Gustavo shook his head, visibly disagreeing. No, it's not ridiculous. It's simply a matter of believing in who you are and what you can do. A couple of hours later, Gustavo and Dan were coming out of the recruiting office, Dan holding a large envelope in his hand. What did I tell you? Gustavo said. All you had to do is ask, and the sergeant obeyed you without batting an eyelid, didn't he? I thought he would ask me why, at least question the purpose. No, Dan, the Army or the Navy doesn't function that way. When an officer asks you to do something, you just say, yes, sir, right away, sir, and obey the order. Sounds like you've been there before, have you? Yeah, in another life I was obeying orders too, Gustavo replied pensively. Why are you living in a shelter, if I may ask? Gustavo stopped walking abruptly and turned to face his friend. I've done one too many tours to the Middle East, Dan, and I couldn't cope with my old life when I got home, that's all. He looked down at his feet for a moment. And if you were ever sent overseas when you've completed your training, just remember one thing, you won't be the same person when you get back.